On a cold March evening in 1922, in a remote Bavarian village, the Hinterkaifeck farm stood alone, surrounded by thick woods and frozen fields. The farmhouse, simple and sturdy, had sheltered the Gruber family for decades. Yet, in those final days of March, the air carried something heavier than winter. The villagers whispered about the strange isolation of the farm. Even among country people used to silence, Hinterkaifeck felt cut off, as if it sat on the edge of the world. And perhaps it was, because in a matter of hours, it would become a place that no one in Germany would ever forget. Andreas Gruber, the 63-year-old patriarch, was known as a hard and difficult man. His wife Cecilia, older than him by 3 years, had grown quiet with age, bearing the sharpness of her husband's tongue and the shadow of family secrets. Their daughter Victoria, a widow, lived with them after her husband reportedly died during the war. She was young, attractive, and carried her own mysteries, whispers of relationships that were not meant to be. With her were her 2 children. Little 7-year-old Cecilia, full of life, and Joseph, just 2, whose parentage had always been a subject of speculation among neighbors. Alongside them was Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, who had only just arrived at the farm to take over household duties. She was looking forward to a fresh start, unaware that her first night at Hinterkaifeck would also be her last. In the days before the murders, strange things began to happen. Andreas told his neighbors that he had found footprints in the snow leading from the forest to the farmhouse, but none returning back. He swore he heard noises in the attic at night, the sound of footsteps pacing slowly above their heads. Keys went missing. Doors that were locked seemed to open again on their own. The family dog barked at shadows no one else could see. The maid who worked before Maria had quit abruptly, insisting that the house was haunted. Nobody listened closely enough. And now the signs of dread had built into something that no one could stop. March 31st, 1922. It began like any other day, but ended in blood. No one knows the exact sequence of events, but investigators pieced together a grim narrative. One by one, members of the family were lured into the barn. Perhaps they heard a noise. Perhaps the cows were restless. Andreas went first, stepping into the cold barn air, and there the killer struck him down with a mattock, a heavy farming tool. His wife, hearing the disturbance, followed. She too was cut down. Victoria, then little Cecilia, each entered. Each was slaughtered with brutal precision. The killer stacked their bodies in the hay, covering them with sheets and straw, as if to hide them even in death. Inside the house, Maria was attacked in her bedroom, never even given a chance to escape. Finally, the youngest, little Seth, was murdered in his crib. 6 lives, extinguished in silence, on that isolated farm. What came after was almost more disturbing than the murders themselves. The killer didn't leave right away. For days, someone stayed in the farmhouse. The cows were fed. Meals were cooked. Smoke rose from the chimney. The dog was let out, then tied back up again. It was as if the murderer had slipped into the lives of the family he had destroyed, continuing their routines while their bodies lay hidden in the barn. Neighbors, passing by, saw the smoke and assumed all was well. But no one spoke to the family. No one entered. For almost a week, the murderer lived undisturbed in a house full of corpses. When the silence finally drew suspicion, neighbors entered and uncovered the horror. In the barn, beneath the hay, they found the bodies stacked together, faces shattered beyond recognition. In the house, the maid and the baby. Panic spread across the village. Who could do such a thing? Why had the killer stayed? And perhaps most chilling of all, where had he gone when he finally left? The police arrived, but their investigation would be hampered by the crude tools of the time and the overwhelming secrecy of rural life. Heads were removed from the corpses and sent to Munich for analysis, but were lost during the chaos of World War II. No weapon was ever definitively recovered. No suspect was ever convicted. The case remains one of the most terrifying and enduring mysteries of the 20th century. Theories sprang up immediately. Some said it was Lawrence Schlittenbauer, a neighbor with a complicated history with Victoria, who had fathered Joseph, or at least believed he had. He had reason, opportunity, and knowledge of the farm. Yet nothing tied him directly. Others believed in a drifter, perhaps the same one who had been hiding in the attic, feeding on the family's fear before murdering them. Some whispered of an incestuous relationship between Andreas and Victoria, and the possibility that her late husband was not truly dead, but returned for vengeance. Each theory opened a new door into darkness, and none could be proven. The murders at Hinterkaifeck live on because they are both savage and inexplicable. The image of footprints in the snow with no return. The maid quitting in fear. The killer waiting in the attic. The bodies stacked neatly in the barn. The meals cooked afterward as if nothing had happened. These details linger because they make no sense, and yet they are all true. It is not only the violence that horrifies, but the silence that followed, the quiet continuation of life in a house of death. To this day the farm is gone, demolished by villagers who could no longer bear its presence, but the story refuses to die. It is whispered in true crime circles, studied by historians, and feared by all who learn of it. Hinterkaifeck remains an open wound, an unanswered question, a case that stares back at you with cold, lifeless eyes. The discovery of the Hinterkaifeck murders shook the tiny village to its core. When the neighbors first uncovered the barn, the silence was broken by screams of shock. The sight was unbearable. 6 people who had been part of daily life were now lying lifeless, covered crudely with straw. The villagers, hardened by years of war, poverty and loss, had seen death before. But not like this. This was too intimate, too brutal, too close to home. Fear spread like wildfire, and suspicion followed quickly after. No one could be trusted. Anyone could be the murderer. The police arrived from Munich, bringing investigators unfamiliar with such rural isolation. They quickly realized they were working in an environment where secrets ran deep and trust was scarce. Everyone in the village had opinions about who was guilty, but no one had real proof. The Gruber family had not been well liked. Andreas, the father, was despised by many for his cruelty and controlling nature. His relationship with Victoria, his daughter, was the most disturbing of all. Court records showed he had been convicted years earlier of incest with her, a scandal that had never fully gone away. Rumors claimed he continued to force himself on her even after his conviction. Victoria's son Joseph might not have been the child of her late husband at all. Some believed Joseph was Andreas's own child. Others whispered that the boy was the son of their neighbor, Lawrence Schlittenbauer. Either possibility gave strong motives for resentment, rage and revenge. Lawrence, in particular, became the center of attention. He had been involved with Victoria, and was even rumored to have been ready to marry her at one point. But Andreas disapproved, and the arrangement fell apart. Lawrence believed he was Joseph's father, and had even supported the boy financially for a short time before pulling back. On the day the bodies were found, Lawrence was among the first to enter the farmhouse. Witnesses said he seemed oddly calm, too comfortable with the scene. He went straight to Joseph's crib, moved items around, and behaved as though he belonged there. Was it the shock of loss, or the behavior of a man who already knew what he would find? The police interrogated him again and again, but each time he slipped away without conviction. As days turned into weeks, the horror only deepened. Investigators realized the killer had lived at the farm for several days after the murders. Neighbors had seen smoke rising from the chimney, meals had been eaten, and the cows had been fed. Some reports even suggested fresh bread had been baked in the oven. This detail disturbed the villagers more than the murders themselves. It meant the killer had not simply struck and fled in a fit of violence. He had settled into the family's life, performing their routines while their bodies rotted a few feet away. It was a chilling sign of control, domination, and perhaps even a twisted satisfaction. The crime scene itself added to the mystery. The barn showed no signs of struggle, as if each victim had entered willingly, unaware of what awaited them. Why would 4 family members, one after the other, walk into a trap? The theory grew that the killer had lured them one by one with noises or disturbances among the animals. Each would have gone to investigate, only to be bludgeoned by the waiting figure. The weapon, believed to be a mattock, was never definitively found. Later, decades after the murders, a farmer renovating his property discovered a blood-stained mattock buried under floorboards, but it could never be proven to be the murder weapon. Meanwhile, the villagers sank into paranoia. They locked their doors at night, armed themselves with hunting rifles, and eyed their neighbors with suspicion. Every man had a motive, and every family carried secrets. Some said a drifter had done it, a stranger passing through the countryside. But who could have lived in the house for days afterward without being noticed? Others believed the killer had to be someone from the village, someone so familiar that the family felt no need to fear him. The isolation of Hinterkaifeck worked both ways. It shielded the killer, just as it had trapped the victims. The youngest victim, 7-year-old Cecilia, showed signs that haunted investigators for years. When her body was found, her hair was clutched in her hands, torn from her own scalp. Doctors concluded she had not died instantly. She had survived the blow long enough to pull her own hair in agony, lying among her dead family members until life finally slipped away. This detail, perhaps more than any other, revealed the cruelty of the crime. It was not just murder. It was torture, fear, and suffering drawn out across hours. The maid, Maria, was the least connected to the family's conflicts. She had only arrived that very day. Had she been killed to eliminate a witness? Or had the murderer known she was coming and timed his attack accordingly? Maria had been hoping for a new beginning, free from the troubles of her old employment. Instead, her life ended in violence before it could even start. As investigators worked, the case only grew colder. Evidence was mishandled, the crime scene contaminated by curious villagers before police arrived. The bodies were decapitated, and their heads sent to Munich for forensic analysis, but during World War II they were lost, leaving the crime forever unsolved. The farm itself stood for years afterward, a grim reminder to all who passed. Finally, unable to bear the sight, villagers demolished the farmhouse in 1923. The land became empty fields, but the memory could not be erased. The mystery of Hinterkaifeck continued to spread beyond Bavaria. Newspapers picked up the story, emphasizing the bizarre details: the footsteps in the snow with no return path, the dog barking at shadows, the maid who quit because the house felt haunted. It was the perfect mix of true crime and ghost story. Some believed the killer was not a man at all, but something supernatural. How else could he have vanished so completely? How else could he have watched from the attic without detection? Rational minds dismissed these ideas, but in dark corners of Bavaria, people whispered about curses, demons, and vengeful spirits. The case became a riddle without an answer, a puzzle with missing pieces. Each new theory seemed to make sense for a moment before falling apart. Too much time had passed. Too many mistakes had been made. All that remained were shadows, whispers, and the terrible fact that someone somewhere had gotten away with the perfect crime. Even today, more than a century later, the murders remain one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in Europe. Investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths continue to revisit it, hoping to uncover something overlooked. Modern forensic methods might have cracked the case, but the evidence is long gone, lost to time and war. What is left is a chilling story, one that continues to echo in the minds of all who hear it. The family that vanished into death, the farm that stood in silence, and the killer who became part of their lives before disappearing forever. As months turned into years, Hinterkaifeck slipped into legend, but unlike myths that fade with time, this story only grew sharper in memory. People spoke of it in hushed voices, as if saying the name too loudly might awaken the killer from hiding. For some villagers, it was not simply a crime. It was a scar that never healed, a reminder that even in the quietest countryside, evil could creep in unnoticed. The police tried to pursue every lead. They questioned Lawrence Littenbauer repeatedly, convinced that his history with Victoria and his strange behavior at the crime scene made him guilty. But no matter how suspicious he appeared, nothing tied him directly to the murders. His alibi held just enough weight to keep him from arrest, though many believed he had simply outsmarted investigators. Some claimed he confessed drunkenly in later years, boasting about getting away with it, but others dismissed this as rumor. Without evidence, the case against him dissolved like mist at sunrise. Other theories emerged. One suggested a group of bandits had targeted the farm, planning a robbery that turned into slaughter. But this didn't match the facts. Money and valuables were left untouched in the house, even sitting in plain sight. Whoever killed the family wasn't motivated by greed. Their purpose was darker, more personal. Another idea was that a farmhand or worker, mistreated by Andreas, had returned for revenge. Andreas was known for cruelty, and few mourned his death, but again no proof surfaced. The strangest theory involved the sounds and footsteps the family had noticed before their deaths. Weeks earlier, Victoria had confided to neighbors that she heard footsteps in the attic. Tools went missing, keys disappeared, and doors stood open without explanation. Could the killer have been living in the house long before the murders, watching, waiting, becoming familiar with the family's every movement? If true, it meant the murders were not sudden but planned with meticulous patience. The thought chilled everyone. The Grubers had been sharing their home with a predator without even knowing it. The case files reveal haunting details. On the night of the murders, snow covered the ground, a perfect canvas for footprints. Tracks led from the edge of the forest directly to the back door of the farmhouse. But there were no footprints leading away. Whoever entered that night never left, at least not by the same path. Had he remained inside the whole time, tending to the animals, eating their food, and listening to the silence of the dead? The thought was unbearable. The villagers began locking their homes tighter than ever, but no lock could keep out the idea that someone could live inside your walls without your knowledge. The police themselves were unsettled. They had solved countless murders before, yet this one mocked them. Every lead collapsed. Every suspect slipped away. As frustration grew, blame shifted. The villagers accused the police of incompetence. The police accused the villagers of withholding the truth. Perhaps someone knew more than they admitted. Perhaps the killer was protected by silence, shielded by fear or loyalty. In a place as small as Hinterkaifeck, everyone was connected. To accuse one man was to accuse a neighbor, a friend, even family. Easier to remain quiet, even if it meant living with terror. As the years dragged on, the farmhouse itself became a symbol of dread. Travelers avoided it. Children dared each other to run past its broken windows. Some swore they heard cries from inside, or saw shadows moving when no one lived there. The new maid's story about feeling watched became part of local folklore. She had fled in fear, and many believed she had sensed the truth that someone else was already living there. After the murders, when her replacement died alongside the family, people saw it not as coincidence but as confirmation. The house itself was cursed, they said, and would never rest. Finally, in 1923, the decision was made to tear it down. Men gathered with axes and hammers, striking at the walls that had witnessed such horror. Some workers reported strange feelings as they dismantled the home, as though unseen eyes followed their every move. The rubble was cleared, the earth leveled, and a memorial was placed to mark the spot. But even without the house, the story refused to vanish. The land was empty, but the memory was alive, retold in whispers at taverns and around firesides. The name Hinterkaifeck had become eternal. What makes the case so unsettling even today is not just the brutality, but the intimacy. These murders weren't distant or anonymous. They weren't the work of a stranger in a city alley.
They happened in a home, to a family by someone who knew them, or at least knew enough to move through their lives like a shadow. The killer didn't just take their lives, he claimed their routines, their animals, even their meals. It was as if he wanted to erase them entirely and step into their place. For modern investigators, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain a riddle. In the early 2000s, German police reopened the case, studying the surviving evidence with modern techniques. They came closer than anyone before to identifying a prime suspect, but out of respect for descendants, they never released the name publicly. They admitted that while they believed they had solved the case, the lack of surviving physical evidence made a conviction impossible. The name remains sealed, and the mystery remains intact, and perhaps that's why the story continues to draw fascination, because we still don't know. Was it Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the bitter neighbor and possible father of little Joseph? Was it a hidden stranger who crept through the attic until the right moment to strike? Was it someone else entirely, a figure erased from history but preserved in whispers? Whoever it was, they carried a darkness that few human beings can comprehend. To kill 6 people, including children, and then linger in their home requires more than anger. It requires something colder, something inhuman. Even now, if you visit the site where Hinterkaifeck once stood, locals will tell you not to linger after sunset. Some claim the air feels heavier there, as if the land itself remembers. Some visitors say they hear the distant lowing of cattle, even though no animals remain. Others swear they've seen footprints in fresh snow leading nowhere. These stories blur the line between fact and fear, but maybe that's the point. The truth of Hinterkaifeck is not just in what happened but in what it left behind, a question that will never be answered, and a terror that never fully fades. Time did not heal Hinterkaifeck. Instead it layered the wounds with myths. The villagers who once whispered about the Gruber farm began to die out, but the story lived on, passed down to new generations who never met the family yet felt their presence every time the name surfaced. It became less about 6 people, and more about a shadow that still lingered over Bavaria. What frightened people most was not simply the brutality, it was the silence that followed. Normally a murder leads to arrests, trials, answers, but Hinterkaifeck offered none of these. No courtroom ever echoed with testimony, no confession ever came. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed the truth, leaving only speculation. That absence became fuel for obsession. People began filling the void with their own theories, their own nightmares. Some swore the murders were not human at all. Farmers told tales of demons that haunted the woods, feeding on human fear. They said Andreas Gruber, with his cruelty and abuse, had brought a curse on his own household. Others linked it to old folklore, spirits that demand blood if disturbed, guardians of the land that take revenge when disrespected. To outsiders these sounded like desperate excuses, but in isolated villages, where the night was pitch black and the forest loomed like a wall, superstition was not a luxury, it was survival. Yet even as legends grew, real-world suspicion never died. Lorenz Schlittenbauer remained at the center. Neighbors recalled how quickly he had inserted himself into the investigation, leading police through the barn and house, as if he already knew where bodies lay. Some thought his behavior reflected guilt, that his knowledge came not from discovery but from memory. He had fought bitterly with Andreas. He may have resented Victoria for keeping Joseph's fatherhood uncertain, and the timing arriving so quickly after the murders made people question if he was drawn back by guilt, or if he never left the scene in the first place. But Lorenz also lived openly in the community for decades after. If he was the killer, he carried the weight without ever slipping up. Would a guilty man remain in plain sight, knowing eyes burned into his back every day? Or was his calmness the very sign of a man who had committed the perfect crime? The story might have ended as an unsolved mystery, but it refused to stay buried. Each decade brought new investigators, amateur detectives, and journalists digging through the same fragments of evidence, hoping fresh eyes might see what others missed. Old letters surfaced, testimonies re-examined. In the 1950s, a woman claimed her brother confessed to the murders on his deathbed. In the 1970s, a retired police officer swore the answer had always been clear but covered up to protect reputations. In the 2000s, DNA analysis offered hope. Perhaps hair or blood preserved in archives could reveal the truth. But contamination and decay crushed that dream. The evidence was too far gone. Even the smallest details fascinated researchers. The axe, for example, was found hidden in the attic after the house was demolished. Why would the killer stash it instead of taking it away? Did he intend to return? Or was it a message, leaving behind the weapon like a signature? Another unsettling detail: the victims' skulls were removed during autopsy and sent to Munich for examination. But during World War II, those skulls were lost or destroyed in bombings. Without them, much of the forensic truth is forever erased. The more people studied, the less certain anything became. Theories multiplied. Some believed multiple killers were involved. Others argued it was a lone madman. Some focused on Joseph's paternity, suggesting the murders were sparked by forbidden love and bitter revenge. Each angle explained something, but none explained everything. That is the curse of Hinterkaifeck. It answers no questions but raises endless ones, and still the land itself remains. Today, if you walk where the farm once stood, you'll find only fields and a small shrine. Tourists visit, drawn by the story's notoriety. Locals avoid it, claiming the place carries bad luck. Farmers refuse to build on the soil, convinced it is tainted. At night the site is eerily silent, as if even animals sense the weight of history pressing down. Some say if you stand there long enough you feel watched, the same way the Grubers once felt in their final days. What makes this story endure is not just horror, it's familiarity. We all understand the fear of home being violated, of footsteps in the dark, of not knowing who to trust. The Grubers lived in isolation, but their nightmare is universal. That's why people keep returning to the case, writing books, making films, sharing theories. Hinterkaifeck is not just about a family murdered, it's about the thin line between safety and vulnerability, between trust and betrayal, between life and the moment everything ends with an axe. And that is why the mystery still matters, not because of who did it, but because it forces us to ask, what would we do if the walls around us began whispering, if footsteps echoed in our attic, if the person we trusted most carried the darkest secret? The Grubers never had answers, neither do we, and maybe that's what makes it timeless. The scariest story is not one that ends, but one that refuses to. What unsettled investigators most wasn't only the brutality of the murders, it was the routine that followed. Imagine walking into a farmhouse where 6 lives had been taken, and instead of chaos, you find order. Beds made, dishes cleaned, livestock fed. Even the dog chained outside barked as though his master had never left. Whoever killed the Grubers did not vanish into the night. They stayed, they lingered, they lived in the same house with the corpses only feet away. That detail alone transformed the story from a murder into something darker, a twisted occupation of another family's life. Villagers could not make sense of it. Why would someone remain there? Was it arrogance, fear of being caught on the road, or was it pleasure? The killer taking satisfaction in controlling the farm after ending its owners. Some even whispered that perhaps the intruder wasn't a stranger at all, but someone who wanted to claim the household permanently, someone who slipped into their roles, fed their animals, cooked in their kitchen, and wore their lives like a disguise. That possibility terrified people far more than an outsider, because if it was an outsider, it was random. But if it was one of their own, then it meant trust had already been broken. It meant anyone could be smiling at you in daylight, and sharpening an axe for you at night. The autopsies revealed even more unsettling details. Andreas and Cecilia had defensive wounds, suggesting they saw their killer and tried to fight back. Victoria's face had been beaten beyond recognition, almost as if the killer's rage was aimed squarely at her. Little Cecilia's death was perhaps the cruelest. She survived her injuries for hours, maybe even a full night, pulling out her own hair in pain before finally succumbing. That kind of suffering doesn't just happen. It's deliberate, it's slow, it's intimate. The baby Joseph, lying in his crib, was killed with a blow to the head. Some wondered if he was the true target, if the killer believed Joseph was Schlittenbauer's child, or worse, Andreas's child from an incestuous relationship. Then the boy's existence was proof of scandal. Killing him might have been the motive. The others may have simply been obstacles in the way. But here's what always stops researchers cold. There were no clear signs of forced entry. Doors were either unlocked or opened willingly. If the killer was a stranger, how did they get inside without causing alarm? If the killer was familiar, then the family might have welcomed them in, not realizing they were inviting in death itself. Decades later, people still argue about what happened first. Did the killer lure each victim into the barn, one by one, using noises to draw them out? Or did the attack start inside, and the barn became the stage for slaughter after? No sequence makes complete sense. Each has gaps. Each leaves questions unanswered. Over time, suspicion began to turn toward the broader community. What if multiple people were involved? A group who planned it, carried it out, and swore to silence together. That would explain how the crime remained hidden for so long. Fear of breaking the pact kept everyone quiet. Some villagers even hinted that everyone knew more than they admitted. That guilt was shared silently across the community. The Grubers themselves were not loved. Andreas was known as a cruel man, harsh with neighbors and family alike. Rumors of incest between him and Victoria disgusted many. Some argued that if anyone deserved retribution, it was him. But does hatred explain the slaughter of a 2-year-old, or the slow suffering of a little girl? Hatred may start a fire, but it rarely burns with such precision. When people look at Hinterkaifeck today, what grips them is not only the horror but the wrongness of the scene. It doesn't fit normal patterns. Killers usually flee, robbers usually steal, madmen usually leave chaos. But here it was none of those. Instead it felt calculated, as though the crime itself was just one part of a larger ritual. The murders were not the end. They were the beginning of something we still cannot name. And the strangest part, despite endless theories, no deathbed confession ever surfaced. In a case like this, time is supposed to reveal truth. People grow old, their conscience cracks and secrets spill. But not here. Even as generations passed, silence held. If the killer lived among them, he took the truth to his grave. If the killer was an outsider, he vanished so perfectly that history erased him. Both options are equally chilling.